week, which will be a portion of the Fight Night Picks Sidekick live for the main card, we have Kentucky's own, the Hurricane, Harry Hunsucker, looking to make Tyson Pedro Hunsuck it. And for Tyson Pedro, came back after forever away to get a first-round finish over Ike Villanueva, where the leg kicks really were the story of the fight. And once he was able to drop Ike at the end of the first round, a couple of uppercuts down on the mat, really able to finish it off. And for Tyson Pedro, this is a guy that UFC fans have known and loved since he made his debut years ago. And for Pedro, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, black belt in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, and he does have a black belt in karate as well. And when you watch Pedro, I mean, very, very fun and intriguing fighter. He dropped Ovince St. Preux only to get straight arm locked in that fight. Really weird. You look at it, there were obviously some stumbling blocks. He tried to make a good account of himself against Shogun Rua until late career stage. Shogun was able to
early, though,
show his veteran guile and hurt Pedro's knee. And from that knee on, that's where the career really did get derailed. And if you look at it for Pedro, his brother-in-law is Tai Tuivasa, a guy who's been close to the camp throughout. But you look at Pedro ahead of his fight against Ike Villanueva, switched it up at City Kickboxing. You had Carlos Alberg there. Eugene Behrman looked really good. Sticking with the sauce for this matchup against Harry Hunsucker, who's throwing it out on Instagram. He's the most doubted UFC fighter out there, and I get it. He is 7-5. You look at it on Dana White's Contender Series. Looked great against Jared Vanderaa, until he didn't. He makes a short notice UFC debut on just days' notice against Tai Tuivasa. Isn't able to get the win there. Takes on a guy in Justin Tafa, where Tafa, they're going for grappling exchange. Tafa ends up on top, and then they get back to standing, and Tafa finishes it. How weird is it, though? You talk about UFC matchmaking. Why throw Harry Hunsucker in there against another Australian?
That is weird. Just why are you putting him in this position to begin with? I understand for Tyson Pedro, we're still trying to gauge where he is in this division, but you go from beating Ike Villanueva, who, okay, it means that you still belong in the sport and in this organization. You would think he would get a significant jump up in competition after that to see, okay, what percentage of the old Tyson Pedro are you still? And I just don't really feel like he's necessarily getting that jump in competition against Harry Hunsucker.
But Matt, how many fights at light heavyweight has Harry Hunsucker had in his pro career?
Didn't he have 2 early or
no?
None?
He had none.
Exactly. So now you're making a guy who has had a bit of a saltier record in the division and just throughout his career, cut a massive amount of weight to not fight a small guy at light heavyweight, and that has to be said too. Tyson Pedro is as big of a fighter as you can get for this division. He would look very similar to Jamal Hill. They stack up very similarly to each other. So I do feel like Tyson Pedro, he definitely has the grappling advantage in this matchup. We've seen him offensively have really nice submissions. I always go back to the Saberbeck-Safarov fight where he just sort of grabs his arm and wrenches it backwards. It was a really, really nice performance from him. And I know Saperbeck's not necessarily the cleanest guy you've ever seen in the UFC, but still.
What do you mean? He doesn't wash well?
You get what I mean. He's not the cleanest technically in the UFC, but Tyson Pedro has shown glimpses of being a very promising prospect. And I know injuries have somewhat derailed that hype train from where it once was. He was a favorite against Ilir Latifi at one point, which is kind of wild to think about in hindsight, because Ilir then went on to beat Ovince St. Preux and have sort of his mini little run there. So Tyson Pedro at one point was thought of as sort of an Ankalaev type or Jamal Hill guy. He's going to go on to main event fight nights. He's going to go on to beat some of these legends. But after that Shogun loss and the knee injury, it really is hard to figure out what is Tyson Pedro's overall ceiling. Now, I do expect him to be the much longer range striker in this fight, and I know that's weird to say, because like you said, Hunsucker is a heavyweight moving down to light heavyweight, but Tyson Pedro throws kicks like an MFer, and not just to the head, not just to the body, but to the legs too, and this isn't a new part of his game. He even used those same kicks against Shogun in the first round of their fight. He hurt Shogun with a front kick up the middle, and kicks have always been a really unique part of Tyson Pedro's game because he is so long and rangy. I will say this though, I vividly remember Tyson Pedro's UFC debut against Khalil Roundtree. Khalil Roundtree hit him one time and put him on the ground with a straight right, and Tyson Pedro has shown the inability to sort of cover up defensively. When it rains, it pours with his striking defense, so let's say Hunsucker can have some success early, maybe he could start rolling downhill a la Giannis in the transition and have some success. I just think he's going to run into a lot of issues if he does start to charge forward. That's when the grappling of Pedro can start to take over, and I think that's an area where he has an overwhelming advantage in.
Harry Hunsucker's 0-3 when Dana White's in the building. Contender Series and 2 fights in the UFC. He's 0-2 in the UFC against Australians. This is his second Australian. Tyson Pedro, I talked about it earlier on this card with a couple of different fighters. His striking defense is hands right here. The Stihl brush saw. I'm going to keep talking about it until they
Stihl.
sponsor the show. Oh, wait, Simon Stihl. He keeps his hands incredibly low, and then he waits for his opponent to come in. He can counter. He can push offensively, throw. He does punch from weird angles. We talked about some of these guys where, like,
And the kicks are good.
Luis Saldana keeps his hands low, but then he eats a lot of shots for his troubles. The thing about Harry Hunsucker, all of his fights have gone to a finish. There's been no decisions as a pro. For Hunsucker, the great thing that he can do is duck down for a level change, because 5 of his wins are by submission. Normally he clubs you down and then subs you like Gerald Mearshart.
Club and sub.
But he can duck levels, come up over with the overhand right, and that's a spot where Pedro struggles because his hands are already low, susceptible to a takedown, like in the Latifi fight. Hunsucker comes over the top, gets a finish win, and everybody that doubted Harry Hunsucker looks like a silly goose to that point. So again, Hunsucker's to the point where, just like Billy Talent, like, nothing to lose. And he gets a big opportunity on this pay-per-view main card to get a win over Pedro, who's an inflated favorite. He opened a minus 750. He's a minus 800. I'm not adding this a leg to anything. I'm just going to watch it on the sidekick. Hunsucker open plus 550. They say plus 530 or thereabouts. So Hunsucker, big underdog. Pedro, big favorite. We saw it against Ike Villanueva, Hurricane Ike. Seems like that's just a tricky nickname there. Now, from Hurricane Ike to Hurricane Hunsucker. Good opportunity for him there. We have a look at the topology votes, Matt. Surprise to us there to you. I'm going to say over under 95% Pedro.
I'll say under just because that's a wild percentage, but it's still over.
815 total votes. 97% Pedro, 84% by knockout for the 3% that have Hunsucker, 58% by knockout. Matt, I think we're going to get a finish in this fight. I think that's better than minus 800 Pedro, so maybe you go with that one. I'm eager to see what Hunsucker looks like at 205. From his Instagram, he does look really good, so I'm eager to see where he weighs in at. I think he's got a good opportunity here to get a win over a giant name, especially on a main card, but kind of like Zach Borrego on Dana White's Contender Series last week. I think Bo Nickel came through. Pedro's going to come through in the spot, too.
Yeah, I think Tyson Pedro is the much more technical guy in this matchup, so it is hard to pick against him. And let's say things do hit the map for any period of time. Tyson Pedro does have a very nice submission repertoire that I could see finishing Harry Hunsucker at some point throughout this matchup. So I do like Tyson Pedro, but it should be a fun fight.
Both of us going with Tyson Pedro in the matchup this week. He's way too big of a favorite. Maybe avoid that one. It's just a pick on Fight Night Picks. We have a big-time main card coming up, including Alexandr Romanov versus Marcin Tybura. Jose Aldo, Dvalishvili. Co-main event, Luke Rockhold versus Paulo Costa. And in the main, Kamaru Usman's taking on Leon Edwards for a second time. Can't wait for it. Keep locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say.
Let's get into it.